Japan has some of the most beautiful forests to be found anywhere on Earth. But could they be fake? Let's look into it. So recently I was reading a fantastic article in the Japan Times about the now extinct Japanese wolf. I plan to cover the topic in more detail in the future because it really deserves a video of its own. But if you don't know already, the Japanese wolf is supposed to have gone extinct back in the early 1900s, I believe. But there are still those out there who believe it could be alive, it could survive somewhere in remote pockets of Japan. Anyways, I'll leave a link in the description. You should really check it out. It actually doesn't require a subscription to read that particular series, so I highly recommend it. So at some point in the article, the author is talking to a local man living in the Chichibu Mountains up in northern Japan somewhere. And they're talking about the Japanese wolf and the possibility of it still surviving in the forests of the nearby mountains. And in the article, the man replies, "Look at those mountains. The native forests have been replaced by secondary forests. If wolves are still alive, I wonder where they would live." That's a good question. Japan's forests cover approximately 25 million hectares, accounting for 2/3 of the nation's total area. But around 40% has been artificially replanted with fast-growing conifers. Chishima's the man who he's talking to, the local man. Chishima remembers how the forests he saw growing up were raised during the nation's post-war economic boom. Raised as in, like, leveled, basically. Forever changing the face of the mountains of Chichibu. Where, indeed, would the wolves live today? As someone who's spent the better part of the last 10 years exploring Japan's wilderness, my heart sank immediately when I read this. I had so many questions. What did they mean by artificial? Had I been living a lie this whole time, thinking I was venturing into ancient primordial forests when in fact I was really just taking a series of strolls through what were essentially tree farms here in Japan? Well, I wasted no time getting to the truth of the matter, and it turns out that there's a little bit of truth to what's said in the story, but it's a bit more complicated than that, and I intend to share what I found with you in this video today. Okay, but before I start, I need to clear up some misconceptions that a lot of people have about Japan. When a lot of people picture this country, they imagine overcrowded, large population centers with bright lights and skyscrapers where everyone is living in shoebox-size apartments for lack of any space. Now, of course, there's some truth to this, but only if you're living in one of the huge metropolitan centers like Osaka or Tokyo or something like that. However, what this image of Japan fails to take into account is that 67% of this country is made up of forests, with another 14% being agricultural lands. That's over 80% open land. And when you take into consideration the fact that a lot of Japan's smaller islands and smaller population centers are rapidly becoming depopulated these days, suddenly Japan doesn't seem so overcrowded after all. In fact, the geography of Japan, mainly the fact that the vast majority of the landscape is made up of one continuous, immense mountainous spine that runs through the interior of this country from north to south, means that most of this country is never going to be inhabitable. In my experience, Japan has some of the most breathtaking scenery to be found anywhere, which is why the claims in this article hit me so hard. So today, let's look at the facts and pick apart some of the details here and see how much truth there actually is to this. So yes, as the article states, around 40% of Japan's forests are nowadays artificial. But what exactly does this mean? Japan has a diverse range of forest types, the character of which changes as you go from south to north and from lower elevations to higher elevations, with overlapping areas in between. Okay, so I'm not an expert on the subject, meaning the subject of forest types and different types of trees, so I won't go into too much detail, but what I can say is that while Japan still maintains this diversity of forest cover to a large extent, Originally, the forests, at least those that were artificially replanted and fall into this 40% category, were much healthier, more diverse, and in far better balance than they are today. Although the altering of this balance would begin thousands of years ago as humans spread across Japan, it wasn't until the 20th century that a process would begin that would leave a lasting impact on Japan's ancient forests. The first acceleration would begin in the lead up to World War II, as Japan needed vast amounts of timber to support its war effort. The second period of major acceleration would begin after the war was over. At this time, there was a significant decrease in the demand for firewood and charcoal as fossil fuels began to replace these during the post-war period. However, unfortunately, this didn't lead to a reprieve for Japan's forests. You have to remember that the post-war recovery period in Japan was one of rapid economic expansion, and suddenly they needed timber and lumber more than ever. For building materials, wood for buildings, also wood pulp to be used in like lower quality forms of boards and wood and things like that. So essentially it was for building materials. What this meant was that Japan needed a lot of wood, and it needed it fast. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the types of forests you can find here in Japan and the types of trees. As I mentioned, I'm not a huge expert on the subject, but in my research, I was fascinated to learn that there is such a diverse range of native and endemic tree species here in Japan. It's a topic that I really want to learn more about, but for now, let's just kind of give a surface level overview of it. Okay, so there are several different classifications of forests in Japan. And I won't cover them all, but a couple of examples are deciduous, broadleaf, and coniferous forests, with some overlap among them. Back in the 1960s, when the Forestry Service here in Japan began its clear-cutting campaign, they would essentially go into wide swathes of forest, of naturally growing forest. They would cut everything down and level it, using whatever wood they could from the existing trees. And then they would replant the area with trees that were faster growing and tended to be from the third category I mentioned, conifer trees. The main types of conifers that they typically replanted these areas with were Japanese cypress and cedar trees. Now, an often cited and lamented example of this are the vast swathes of ancient Buna forests that were clear-cut and replanted in this way. Buna are a unique and remarkable tree that provide wonderful habitat for a variety of different plants and animals, including the aforementioned Japanese wolf, that these other conifer forests that they replanted in their place simply didn't. But unfortunately for the Buna tree, its usefulness as a building material and as a source of wood for crafting and things like that is somewhat limited. It tends to warp rather quickly, and it also rots a lot faster than these more suitable conifer trees. Okay, so although these conifer trees were actually native to Japan, they were replanted in areas that they either weren't formally, or at least they didn't dominate formally. This replanting essentially created these artificial monocultures that weren't necessarily conducive to the life that once lived there. This drastically decreased biodiversity and led to a series of other negative effects further down the road. Okay, so as the 1960s went on and the demand for lumber continued to skyrocket, prices got so high that it actually became cheaper, ironically, to import lumber from abroad. And eventually it got to a point where Japan, as is the case still to this day, started importing most of its lumber from other countries. Now, of course, this had negative impacts on those other countries that also continues until this day. But back here in Japan, what it created was a situation where all of these essentially sterile tree farms that were replanted just fell into mismanagement, and they were just left unmaintained. This created a really big issue that I can tell you from experience is a problem here in Japan. The cedar tree, known as the sugi, is actually one of the worst causes of hay fever and pollen allergies in Japan. So every, I believe, spring it starts to release all this pollen into the air. And before it was a manageable amount of pollen, but now that there's just entire mountain ranges covered with these trees, it just creates this wafting effect where all this pollen comes into the cities and people are racked with debilitating allergies. Another big issue is that these sorts of trees, these coniferous trees, don't bind soil as well as a lot of the trees did that originally covered these tracts of land. So this has led to an increase in the incidence of landslides here in Japan, which you've probably seen on the news over the last couple of years. Another major and tragic issue. In conclusion, yes, it is true that large areas of Japan are covered in artificial forests. But can we call Japan's forests fake? I wouldn't go that far for 3 reasons. First, there is still great diversity and an abundance of old-growth forests covering large areas of Japan to this day. In fact, I would say a majority of Japan's forests are still relatively healthy. And number 2 is that even these artificially planted trees are native to Japan. And Japanese conifers are beautiful, amazing trees in their own right that play a critical and valuable role, just not so much when they're artificially propagated at the expense of the other trees. And finally, number 3 is that there's hope for the future, as a lot of reforesting and restoration programs are currently underway. So that 40% is being chipped away at even as we speak, and hopefully in the years to come it'll get back down to a smaller number of artificially planted forests. There's still going to be a lumber industry in this country, so we can't expect all forests to be restored to their original glory, but at least if we can get it down to like a 25% range, which I think is manageable, then I'd consider that a healthy range. Okay, so you know, next time you want to get out there and go hike through some forests in Japan, go have fun at your heart's content and rest easy knowing that for the most part, Japanese forests are real and they are healthy. Okay, as usual, everyone, thank you for watching. If you're interested in more content on the outdoors, the natural landscape and history of Japan, or simply just getting outside and making your life more interesting, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel so I can get out there and make more videos like these. Also, I'm always looking for suggestions and ideas for things to cover, so please feel free to continue the conversation in the comments section and give me some ideas for what to cover next. Until next time, take care.